Part 13. Segregation. In the 18th and 19th century, clothing was made of wool or silk. This colorful material was more difficult to clean, so undergarments, made of cotton, would provide a barrier between a person's skin and their clothing. The cotton would absorb perspiration and protect the outer fabrics from stains and odor. The white undergarments would then be separated from the colorful outer wear, and be washed more often. Eventually, sorting whites from colors was used to describe separating people by their race. But when was the term, colored people, first used to describe African Americans? In the late 1800s and early 1900s, popular novels, such as Uncle Tom's Cabin, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and Little House on the Prairie, used every racial slur imaginable to describe black people. But none of those novels include the phrase, colored people. The Oxford English Dictionary says the phrase, colored women, first appeared in the book, A Voyage to South America, written in 1758. But the text seems to refer to the clothing the women of Colombia often wear. Instead of calling them Negroes or mulattoes, they are the women who are adorned with colorful dresses. Aside from that one sentence, the book calls black people, Negro or mulatto. In 1891, there was a cotton pickers' strike in Lee County, Arkansas, organized by African Americans from Memphis. Cotton pickers were paid only 50 cents per 100 pounds of cotton they harvested. They decided to organize a strike, demanding to be paid $1 for that amount of work. However, the idea was quickly squashed by local law enforcement, and black sharecroppers felt they had too much to lose by supporting the movement. Some newspapers printed the story, but since most blacks couldn't read, the idea of organizing a protest never spread throughout the South. We don't know if that short-lived union had an official name, but when you give Negro and African cotton pickers an acronym, it becomes NAACP. The NAACP has a nice ring to it. In 1909, an organization called the NAACP was established in New York. But it had nothing to do with picking cotton or sharecropping. Their acronym means, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's a nice sentiment, but what was that organization really founded on? Encouragement? Encouragement to do what? Most unions have a solid foundation, and the cotton industry would have come to a halt if the workers went on strike. So the acronym was stolen by the North, who replaced African cotton pickers with the Advancement of Colored People. Now there doesn't seem to be anything within that organization which would give black people any leverage. After all, what happens if cheerleaders go on strike? I don't believe it makes much of an impact. Another word which lost its original meaning is segregation. Segregation is actually a hybrid word, combining segue with integration, meaning to slowly bring two groups together. After the Civil War, blacks and whites needed to integrate in the South. But this had to be done gradually. Once black people were considered to be citizens, they were allowed to have access to the same public facilities that whites enjoyed. If a business serves the public, it could not discriminate or refuse service to anyone based on their race. This new law had to be followed, but business owners knew there could be some potential conflict on a personal level. To avoid this, restaurants and theaters began to assign seating areas, similar to smoking and non-smoking sections. Now, theaters could grant entry to any paying customer. Buses could provide transportation to all citizens, regardless of their skin color. And citizens would eventually get used to the idea of sharing these amenities. Public buildings and parks began adding additional drinking fountains. By posting signs, they would reduce friction between the patrons. Now the new laws could be obeyed, while maintaining civil discourse. Unfortunately, historians get this all wrong. Hollywood likes to suggest that black people weren't allowed to use public facilities at all. They believe segregation is the opposite of integration. But the opposite of integration is disintegration, which means tearing something apart. If you're going to separate one group into two or more smaller groups, the original group must already be together. It's like sorting a new box of Legos. But blacks and whites didn't start out together. After a while, people began to wonder how long the transition period was going to last. What began in early 1900 continued well into the 1960s. Naturally, people grew impatient and wanted to see full integration occur. Rosa Parks, for example, grew tired of having to move to the rear of the bus whenever white passengers boarded. So she defiantly remained in her seat. Her protest marks the beginning of the civil rights movement. All of this occurred in the South, while the North sat back and watched, to see if the experiment would work before they would attempt it. That way, if it failed, they wouldn't carry the blame. Even today, Northerners proudly boast, "We didn't have to go through any period of segregation, like those racist Southerners."